The morning light had just begun to stretch over the sleepy town of Fairwood, Georgia, on June 18, 1968, when a silence older than memory was broken. It was the kind of small southern town where time seemed to slow, where church bells marked the hours and porch swings creaked under the weight of gossip and iced tea. But that summer morning, something far darker crept into Fairwood's routine. At 6:42 a.m., a factory worker named Cliff Harper took his usual shortcut through a narrow wooded path on the outskirts of town. It was a walk he had made nearly every day for the last decade, a 5-minute detour from his modest home on Willow Street to the textile mill on the other side of the creek. But that morning, something on the ground caught his eye, something that didn't belong. At first, he thought it was just a bundle of discarded fabric, maybe tossed by a drifter. But as he drew closer, his steps faltered. The bundle was not fabric. It was a body. The woman lay face up, her pale skin ghostly against the dark soil, her once white summer dress now streaked with dirt and something darker. One shoe was missing. Her hair, chestnut brown and carefully set, fanned out around her head like a broken halo. She couldn't have been more than 25. Cliff stumbled backward, heart pounding in his ears, before bolting back toward the road, screaming for help. Within minutes, the first patrol car arrived, its red lights cutting through the mist that clung stubbornly to the ground. Officer Walter Jennings, a 12-year veteran of the Fairwood Police Department, secured the scene, pushing back the small crowd of neighbors that had begun to gather. Most of them recognized the patch of woods. Children played there in the summers. Teenagers carved initials into tree trunks. Hunters cut through on their way to the fields. But no one recognized the woman. The body had no purse, no identification, no jewelry, nothing to tell police who she was or how she had ended up in this forgotten corner of town. But there were signs, chilling signs, that this was no accident. Her hands were scraped and bruised as if she had clawed at the ground. There was a deep, angry mark on her neck, and her left wrist still bore the faint outline of a wedding band that was no longer there. Word spread quickly through Fairwood. By mid-morning, the story was front-page news in the Georgia Herald. Unidentified woman found dead in Fairwood woods. Locals gathered at diners and gas stations, murmuring theories that grew darker with every retelling. Some said she was a runaway from Atlanta. Others insisted she was a secret lover, killed in a jealous rage. But no one knew the truth, and for investigators, that was the most unsettling part. The coroner estimated the woman had been dead less than 12 hours, meaning that whoever had killed her might still be in town, walking among them, drinking coffee, shaking hands, pretending nothing had happened. Detective Harold Latham, one of the department's most seasoned investigators, arrived on the scene just before noon. A former military police officer turned homicide detective, Latham had seen his share of violence. But something about this case felt different. The victim had been left out in the open, not buried, not hidden, as if the killer wanted her to be found. People don't leave bodies like this unless they're trying to send a message, Latham muttered as he studied the scene. But what was the message? And to whom was it meant? As the body was carefully transported to the county morgue, the questions multiplied. There were no missing persons reports that matched her description. No witnesses had reported seeing anything suspicious overnight, and no vehicle tracks or footprints were found near the site. The woods themselves seemed to mock investigators, as if they were swallowing the truth whole. By sunset, the town was already gripped by unease. Parents kept children indoors. Doors that once stayed unlocked were bolted tight, and in a town that prided itself on knowing everyone's name, the idea that a stranger, or worse, a murderer, might be among them sent shivers down every spine. Meanwhile, across town, in a small brick house just 3 streets away, a family sat by the phone, waiting for news. Their daughter, Evelyn Carter, had not come home the night before. She was 23, a bank teller with a reputation for punctuality and kindness. She had left work at 5:15 p.m. as usual, telling a coworker she was headed home to prepare dinner. She never arrived. It would take another 24 hours before dental records confirmed what Detective Latham had already suspected. The woman found in the woods was Evelyn, and with that revelation, the case shifted from a mystery to a nightmare. Fairwood was a town unaccustomed to murder. The last homicide on record had been in 1949, a drunken fight between farmhands. But this was different. Evelyn was well-liked, respected, beloved. She sang in the church choir, she volunteered at the local food pantry. She had no known enemies. Yet someone had taken her life, brutally, deliberately, and left her for the world to see. The investigation was only just beginning, but even in those first few days, one thing was clear. This was no random act of violence. Someone had planned this. Someone had watched her. And someone, perhaps someone Evelyn knew, had followed her into the woods that night and never let her leave. And as whispers turned into fear, and fear into suspicion, one question echoed through every porch, every pew, and every sleepless night in Fairwood. Who killed Evelyn Carter? Detective Harold Latham had been with the Fairwood Police Department for nearly 2 decades, but as he stood beneath the low canopy of trees staring down at the dirt-stained body of Evelyn Carter, he knew this was different from anything the town had faced before. This wasn't a drunken brawl gone too far or a lover's quarrel turned violent. This was calculated, and whoever did it had vanished without a trace. The first hours of any homicide investigation are critical. Officers scoured the wooded path, marking footprints, collecting fibers, and taking photographs before the weather could turn. But the more they searched, the less they seemed to find. There were no signs of a struggle beyond the marks on Evelyn's hands. No foreign hair, no blood trail, no discarded weapon. Whoever had killed her knew how to avoid leaving evidence, or had been lucky enough not to. By midday, the scene was sealed off with yellow tape, and a crowd of residents had gathered at the edge of the clearing, their faces pale and wide-eyed. Fairwood wasn't the kind of place where murder happened. People left their doors unlocked. Children rode their bikes until dark, and neighbors waved to one another in passing. But now whispers of fear rippled through every conversation. Someone in their town, maybe someone they knew, had done this. At the station, detectives began piecing together Evelyn's final hours. Co-workers at the bank confirmed she had left work at 5:15 p.m. as usual, wearing the same white sundress she was found in. She was expected to stop at the grocery store before heading home to cook dinner for her husband and 3-year-old son. But she never made it. Surveillance cameras along Main Street showed her car heading west, away from her house. Where she was going, no one knew. Her husband, Mark Carter, was interviewed first. He appeared shaken, answering every question through tears. They had been married for 5 years, he said, and had spent the previous evening discussing plans for their anniversary. She was happy, he insisted. She wasn't depressed. She wasn't seeing anyone else. She had no reason to leave. He told detectives they'd spoken on the phone just after she left work. She said she'd be home soon, he recalled. She never came back. Investigators combed through Evelyn's home, looking for signs of forced entry or missing belongings. Nothing. Her purse and keys were gone, but her jewelry was untouched, and there was no evidence of a burglary. Her phone was missing too, and attempts to ping it yielded nothing. It had been turned off within an hour of her leaving work. Rumors began swirling almost immediately. Some said she had been meeting someone in secret. Others whispered that her husband was involved. Latham had heard it all before, small-town gossip masquerading as evidence. But he also knew that statistically, the spouse was often the first suspect. Mark was cooperative, but inconsistencies in his timeline raised eyebrows. He claimed to have been home all evening, yet neighbors hadn't seen his car in the driveway until nearly 10 p.m., and when asked to take a polygraph test, he hesitated before finally agreeing. The results were inconclusive. Attention soon shifted to Evelyn's co-workers. One name in particular stood out: Jonathan Pierce, a fellow teller who had recently been reprimanded for sending Evelyn inappropriate messages. He admitted to being infatuated with her, but insisted he had nothing to do with her death. His alibi, dinner with his parents that night, checked out. Weeks passed, and the investigation stalled, Detectives followed every tip, interviewed every acquaintance, and retraced every possible route Evelyn might have taken. But with no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, and no suspect, the case began to grow cold. Newspapers printed theories, talk radio hosts speculated about serial killers, and television crews camped outside the Carter home, hoping for a quote or a breakdown. Meanwhile, Evelyn's family made public pleas for information. Her mother, Margaret, stood before cameras holding a framed photo of her daughter. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking, "if you know anything at all, come forward. My daughter didn't deserve this." It was a plea echoed by neighbors and friends. Candlelight vigils were held in the town square. Flyers blanketed telephone poles. A reward fund was set up by the local church. But despite the community's efforts, leads remained scarce. For Detective Latham, the frustration was unbearable. Every piece of evidence led to a dead end. Every interview raised more questions than it answered. And every day that passed without an arrest made the chances of solving the case slimmer. Then, just as hope was beginning to fade, a break, however small, arrived. A woman named June Calloway came forward with a story. She'd been driving home from work on the night Evelyn disappeared when she'd seen a dark-colored sedan parked near the wooded trail. The driver was standing outside the car, smoking a cigarette. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she remembered one detail: a gold watch that glinted under the streetlight. It wasn't much, but it was something. Detectives canvassed local pawn shops and jewelry stores, hoping someone might remember selling such a watch. None did. They ran checks on registered vehicles matching the sedan's description, dozens in the county, but none linked directly to the crime. Still, the tip reignited the investigation. Meanwhile, forensic analysts continued to work behind the scenes. Soil samples from the crime scene revealed trace amounts of industrial oil, the kind used in automotive repair shops. It was an odd detail, and one that suggested the killer might have worked with vehicles or had access to a garage. The theory led detectives to question employees at nearby auto shops and service stations. Most had airtight alibis. One did not. A mechanic named Carl Jennings, who had abruptly quit his job 3 days after Evelyn's murder. Jennings had a minor criminal record, petty theft, disorderly conduct, but nothing violent. Still, the timing raised suspicions. By the time winter arrived, Jennings had moved out of state. His trail had gone cold. And with it, so had the investigation. Fairwood, once a town defined by its warmth and familiarity, now lived under the shadow of fear. Parents escorted children to school. Couples avoided walking after dark. And every time the wind rustled through the trees, someone wondered if Evelyn's killer was still out there, watching, waiting, blending in among them. The questions that had haunted Fairwood since that summer remained unanswered. Who had followed Evelyn into the woods? Why had they chosen her? And would they ever be caught? For now, there were no answers, only silence, and the growing fear that justice might never come. Evelyn Carter had always been the kind of person people remembered, not because she was loud or attention-seeking, but because she had a warmth that made you feel seen. At 23, she was known throughout Fairwood as the girl who greeted everyone by name when they stepped into the First National Bank. Neighbors described her as graceful but grounded, a young woman with quiet ambition and a contagious optimism that seemed immune to the darker edges of life. She lived alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment on Oak Street, a short walk from the bank, and every Sunday she drove 20 minutes to her parents' farmhouse to help her mother with dinner. Her daily routine rarely changed. She rose early, walked to work with a thermos of black coffee, and spent her lunch break sitting on the courthouse steps reading mystery novels. On Thursdays, she met her best friend Margaret Fields at the diner for pie and gossip. And on Friday evenings, she attended choir practice at St. Mary's Church, a ritual she'd never missed. Those habits would later become crucial in reconstructing her final movements. In the weeks leading up to her death, however, subtle shifts began to surface, Things that at the time seemed inconsequential but now felt like pieces of a puzzle everyone had overlooked. A co-worker recalled Evelyn receiving several phone calls at work that left her visibly unsettled. She'd go pale, excuse herself, and step outside, the co-worker later testified. When she came back, she'd pretend everything was fine, but it wasn't. Margaret, too, noticed changes. During their last lunch together, Evelyn had seemed distracted, her fork idly tracing circles on her plate. When pressed, she brushed it off. "Just tired," she'd said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But there was one thing she did mention, a feeling that someone had been watching her. "She told me she kept seeing the same man near the bank," Margaret remembered. "Once by the post office, once outside her building. She laughed it off, but I could tell it bothered her." Police would later confirm reports of a dark-colored Chevrolet sedan seen idling on Oak Street multiple times in the month before Evelyn's murder. At the time, no one connected it to anything sinister. Fairwood was a small, trusting town. People didn't think in terms of stalkers or predators. But in hindsight, those sightings became ominous footnotes in the final chapter of her life. The last 48 hours before Evelyn vanished were, on the surface, entirely ordinary. On June 16th, she worked her usual shift, processed a handful of mortgage applications, and chatted with a regular customer about the summer picnic planned for the town square. That evening, she stopped by her parents' house for dinner: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and her father's homemade cider. Her mother recalled nothing unusual, except for one detail. Evelyn seemed hesitant when it was time to leave. "She hugged me longer than usual," Mrs. Carter told investigators. "I didn't think much of it then." Now I wonder if she knew something was wrong. On June 17th, the day before she was found, Evelyn's schedule followed its usual pattern. She arrived at the bank at 8:45 a.m., took her lunch break at noon, and left at 5:15 p.m., telling a co-worker she was heading home to make dinner and work on choir arrangements. Witnesses placed her at the corner grocery store around 5:30 p.m., buying milk and bread. At 5:42 p.m., she was seen walking along Willow Street, a paper bag tucked under her arm. That was the last confirmed sighting of Evelyn Carter alive. What happened in the next few hours remains one of the enduring mysteries of the case. She never made it home. Dinner remained uncooked, and the book she'd been reading sat open on her nightstand. A neighbor across the hall reported hearing raised voices in the hallway around 6:15 p.m., but when police followed up, they found no witnesses who could confirm it was Evelyn. Another neighbor thought he saw a dark sedan pull away from the curb around that same time, perhaps the same car that had been spotted weeks earlier, but couldn't make out the license plate. The timeline ends abruptly there, as if Evelyn simply vanished into the warm summer evening. But for investigators, those last glimpses became the scaffolding upon which the entire case rested. Every minute between 5:30 and midnight was dissected, every possible encounter scrutinized. It was during this period that detectives developed their first working theories. Perhaps Evelyn had been abducted by someone she knew, lured into a conversation before being overpowered. Or perhaps she had met someone voluntarily, someone she trusted, only to realize too late the danger she was in. Even her family wrestled with guilt in the aftermath. "We should have noticed something," her father told reporters. "The phone calls, the car, the way she hugged her mother, and we should have known." But the truth was, no one in Fairwood was prepared for the darkness that had crept into their quiet town. Evelyn Carter had lived a life that was, by all accounts, simple and safe. And yet something, or someone, had been circling closer with each passing day. When her body was found less than 12 hours later in those woods, the question wasn't just who killed her. It was how a woman so careful, so loved, and so deeply woven into the fabric of her community could have vanished so quickly, and why no one saw the danger until it was too late. For the first few weeks after Evelyn Carter's body was discovered, Fairwood was a town that refused to sleep. Patrol cars prowled empty streets deep into the night. Detectives pored over witness statements until their eyes blurred. Volunteers combed the woods with flashlights and gloves, searching for a clue, any clue, that might explain how a bright, beloved young woman had been so brutally silenced. But as the summer of 1968 dragged on, the trail began to cool. The autopsy confirmed what investigators already suspected. Evelyn had been strangled. There were no signs of sexual assault, no foreign fingerprints, and no weapon. The medical examiner placed her time of death between 6:30 and 7 p.m., barely an hour after she was last seen alive. Beyond that, there was little to go on. The killer had been careful. Too careful. Every lead that once felt promising collapsed under scrutiny. The mysterious dark sedan seen near her apartment was traced to a traveling salesman with an airtight alibi. The raised voices reported by a neighbor turned out to be a quarrel between two teenagers down the hall. Even the phone calls that had unsettled Evelyn before her death led nowhere. Burner numbers, dead ends, silence. Detectives grew frustrated. "We had everything and nothing," one retired officer recalled years later. A victim, a timeline, a cause of death, but not a single thread that led anywhere. By autumn, the task force had dwindled from a dozen officers to 3. The press stopped printing daily updates, and the community, though still haunted, began to move on. But for Evelyn's family, time did not dull the ache. Her mother visited the patch of woods every week, leaving fresh flowers by the tree where her daughter's body was found. Her father wrote letters, hundreds of them, to police, prosecutors, even private investigators, begging them not to give up. "If you stop looking," one letter read, "then he wins, and I can't live with that." The case file grew heavier with every passing year. By 1970, it filled 2 thick binders. By 1975, it occupied a whole cabinet drawer. Dozens of people had been questioned, some even polygraphed, but none charged. Theories swirled: a jealous ex-lover, a drifter passing through town, a targeted killing disguised as random violence. None of them ever solidified into evidence. And so, the story of Evelyn Carter's murder began to shift, from a crime to a legend. Parents warned their children not to walk alone at night. Teenagers dared each other to visit the site of her death after dark. A local author even wrote a sensationalized paperback claiming Evelyn had been killed by a cult, a theory police dismissed but couldn't entirely disprove. As the years turned into decades, life in Fairwood moved forward, while the Carter family remained anchored to that terrible June evening. Evelyn's younger brother, Thomas, became a police officer, vowing to solve the case himself. Her best friend, Margaret, never left town and never stopped leaving flowers on her birthday. Her parents passed away still hoping for an arrest that never came. By the 1980s, the file was officially classified as a cold case, relegated to the back of a metal cabinet in the basement of the Fairwood Police Department. Every few years, a new detective would pull it out, read through the reports, and try to piece together the puzzle. Each time they'd hit the same brick wall. Yet even as the evidence collected dust, one thing never faded: the weight of Evelyn Carter's absence. For those who remembered her, the pain was evergreen, and for the town, the murder remained a wound that refused to heal. In 1993, 25 years after the killing, Fairwood Police created its first dedicated cold case unit. Evelyn's file was among the first to be reopened. Detectives re-interviewed original witnesses, retested physical evidence with newer methods, and even consulted early DNA labs. But technology was still in its infancy, and the samples they had were too degraded to yield results. The case returned to limbo. Still, whispers persisted. One theory gained traction in the mid-1990s, that Evelyn had known her killer. Investigators noted that there were no signs of forced entry into her apartment, and no evidence of a struggle before she left for her final walk home. Whoever she met that night, she likely trusted them. It was a chilling thought, and one that made the lack of suspects even more maddening. By the time the new millennium arrived, most of the original investigators had retired or died. The last people to see Evelyn alive were grandparents now, and the generation born after 1968 grew up knowing her story not as a news event, but as a ghost story, one that hung over Fairwood like the fog that rolled in from the creek each autumn. Yet deep in the archives, one detective never stopped revisiting the case. Detective Harold Latham, the same man who had stood over Evelyn's body that June morning, spent his retirement poring over the evidence in his spare time. "There's something we missed," he told a reporter in 2001, "and one day, we're going to find it." It was a promise that would take another 2 decades to fulfill. But when that breakthrough finally came, it would come from a place no one expected. A tiny piece of evidence overlooked for nearly 50 years, one that would turn the coldest case in Georgia history into one of its most shocking prosecutions. For more than 4 decades, Evelyn Carter's murder had been one of Fairwood's most haunting mysteries, a story that lived on in whispers and folklore, but had long since vanished from headlines. Entire generations had been born and raised without ever knowing her name. But for Detective Harold Latham, now well into his 70s, Evelyn was never forgotten. Even in retirement, he kept her case file on his kitchen table, rereading every report, every autopsy note, every photograph as if he were searching for a ghost hiding between the lines. In 2012, 44 years after Evelyn's death, the Fairwood Police Department decided to take another shot. Cold case units had become more common across the country as forensic technology advanced, and Fairwood was no exception. Latham, though officially retired, volunteered to consult. The department digitized the old case files, recatalogued physical evidence, and sent several long-stored samples to a modern state crime lab for testing with methods unavailable in 1968. Most expected nothing would come of it, but one small item would change everything. It was a piece of Evelyn's dress, a torn section near the neckline that had been carefully stored in a sealed evidence envelope since the day she was found. At the time, forensic science was limited to blood typing and rudimentary fingerprint analysis. But now, even the smallest trace could yield an entire genetic profile, and that's exactly what it did. In March 2013, the lab reported a partial male DNA profile from the fabric. It was a degraded sample, far too incomplete for an immediate database match, but it was enough to confirm what investigators had long suspected. Evelyn had fought her killer. The DNA was almost certainly from skin cells transferred during the struggle. And even though it didn't lead to a name, it was the most significant evidence the case had seen in decades. The cold case unit doubled its efforts. They re-interviewed surviving witnesses, tracked down relatives of people who had lived in Fairwood at the time, and even reached out to national genealogy services for assistance. It was a painstaking, often frustrating process. But by 2016, on the 48th anniversary of Evelyn's murder, they finally caught a break. A distant relative of the unknown DNA donor had uploaded their genetic profile to a public ancestry database. Using genetic genealogy, the same technique that helped catch the Golden State Killer, investigators built a family tree that narrowed their suspect pool from millions to just 5 men. 3 were dead. 1 was in another state with verifiable alibis. The last was a name that had never appeared once in the original investigation, and yet he had lived less than 2 miles from Evelyn Carter in 1968. His name was Raymond Holt. Holt had been 24 at the time of Evelyn's murder. He was a quiet, unassuming factory worker, known by neighbors as polite but distant. He had no criminal record and had moved out of Fairwood in 1970, eventually settling in South Carolina, where he lived an ordinary life. Marriage, children, even a stint as a volunteer firefighter. To anyone who knew him, he was the last person they'd suspect. But to detectives, the DNA didn't lie. Investigators quietly began digging into Holt's past. They discovered that in the summer of 1968, he had worked part-time at the same bank where Evelyn was employed. Though there was no record of any formal interaction, several former co-workers recalled that Holt had been interested in Evelyn, often stopping by her teller window or lingering near her car in the parking lot. One even remembered Evelyn complaining about a man who gave her the creeps, though she never mentioned his name. The deeper they dug, the darker the story became. Holt's ex-wife told police that he had a violent temper and that she had once seen him choke a neighbor's dog in a fit of rage. A former roommate from the 1970s described finding blood-stained clothes in their shared apartment, which Holt claimed were from a hunting accident. And in 1981, he was quietly questioned in connection with the disappearance of a young woman in South Carolina, a case that remains unsolved to this day. Armed with this new information and a court order, investigators obtained a fresh DNA sample from Holt through a discarded coffee cup. When the lab results came back, the match was undeniable. The DNA from Evelyn Carter's dress and the sample from Raymond Holt were the same. After 48 years, police had their killer. The arrest made national headlines. On a cold January morning in 2017, officers surrounded Holt's modest suburban home and took him into custody without incident. Neighbors watched in disbelief as the man they'd known as a friendly retiree was led away in handcuffs. "I can't believe it," one told reporters. "He used to wave to my kids. He seemed like such a nice man." The news hit Fairwood like a lightning strike. For decades, many had believed the case would never be solved, that Evelyn's killer had escaped justice forever. Now they were faced with a truth almost harder to accept. He had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. When detectives informed Evelyn's surviving brother, Thomas, now a retired police officer himself, he wept openly. "I always believed this day would come," he said at a press conference. "I just wish our parents had lived to see it." But as monumental as the arrest was, it was only the beginning. Holt continued to deny involvement, insisting he had never even met Evelyn Carter. Yet the evidence was overwhelming and prosecutors were confident they could secure a conviction. Still, questions lingered, questions that would only grow louder as the case moved toward trial. Why had Holt targeted Evelyn? Was it obsession, rejection, opportunity? And most chilling of all, had he killed before? Those answers, investigators promised, would come soon. But for now, after nearly half a century, one thing was certain. The long-forgotten ghost of Fairwood had finally found her voice. When Raymond Holt was arrested in January 2017, the case against him appeared strong. The DNA match alone was damning. But investigators knew that to secure a conviction after nearly half a century, they would need more than a genetic link. They needed a story, a chain of evidence, motive, opportunity, and corroboration that would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. And so, the cold case unit doubled down. The first step was a complete forensic re-examination of every piece of evidence collected in 1968. Advances in technology had transformed crime scene analysis since then, and what had once been considered useless debris now held new potential. Crime scene photos were digitally enhanced. Soil samples preserved from the scene were reanalyzed, revealing traces of automotive grease and synthetic fibers, both of which matched substances found in Holt's former workplace. Even more compelling, a microscopic hair found tangled in Evelyn Carter's dress, previously overlooked as contamination, was now conclusively identified as belonging to Holt. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that was telling. Detectives also revisited the original witness interviews, many of which had been conducted hastily in the chaotic days following the discovery. A retired waitress from a local diner, now in her 80s, came forward to clarify a statement she had made decades earlier. Back then, she had told police she saw Evelyn arguing with a man near the town's post office a week before the murder. But the man's description was dismissed as too vague. Now, with Holt's image in front of her, she was certain, "That's him. I'll never forget those eyes." Another breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a box of old personnel records from the textile mill where both Evelyn and Holt had worked. Among them was a disciplinary report filed just 3 months before the murder. It described an incident in which Holt had been reprimanded for following a female co-worker to her car after dark and refusing to leave her alone. The woman's name? Evelyn Carter. This pattern of behavior, fixation, stalking, boundary violations, painted a chilling picture. It suggested that Holt's interest in Evelyn had crossed into obsession long before her death. And as investigators dug deeper, a disturbing timeline emerged. In the weeks leading up to Evelyn's murder, She had confided in friends that someone was watching her. She noticed a man loitering near her apartment building, found notes slipped under her windshield wipers, and even received a series of anonymous phone calls that ended the moment she answered. None of these incidents had been reported to police at the time. In 1968, stalking was rarely treated as a criminal offense, but they now added weight to the prosecution's theory. Evelyn had been targeted. The cold case unit also began looking into Holt's movements in the days surrounding the murder. Historical payroll records revealed that he had called in sick the day after Evelyn was killed, the only sick day he had taken in nearly 2 years. Travel logs showed he had borrowed a friend's truck that same night, a vehicle far better suited to driving into the wooded area where Evelyn's body was found. And most damning of all, his alibi for the night of June 17th, that he was drinking with co-workers, collapsed when one of those co-workers admitted he had lied to protect Holt. "We thought it was just a bar fight or something small," the man told investigators. "If I'd known what he did." The deeper investigators went, the more sinister the portrait became. Holt's psychological profile, compiled by a forensic psychiatrist, described him as a compulsive predator, intelligent, calculating, and driven by a deep-seated resentment toward women who rejected him. Records showed that his mother had abandoned the family when he was a child, and that he had a long history of unstable relationships. In interviews, ex-girlfriends described controlling behavior, violent outbursts, and disturbing fantasies. One even claimed Holt had once confessed to her during a drunken argument that he had done something terrible long ago. It wasn't just Evelyn's case that came under renewed scrutiny. Investigators from 2 other states contacted Fairwood authorities after Holt's arrest, requesting information on their own unsolved cases involving young women who had vanished in the 1970s and 1980s. One involved a hitchhiker whose remains were found near a rest stop in South Carolina, less than 10 miles from Holt's home at the time. Another was a 19-year-old college student last seen leaving a grocery store in Georgia. While no direct evidence linked Holt to these crimes, the similarities were chilling, and detectives quietly began building potential connections. Meanwhile, Evelyn's family was asked to provide updated statements and recollections for trial preparation. Thomas Carter, now in his 60s, remembered something his sister had said the week before she died. "If anything ever happens to me, tell them it wasn't an accident." At the time, he had laughed it off as a joke. Now, those words seemed prophetic. All of this new evidence, the DNA, the fibers, the witness statements, the behavioral history, transformed the case from a fragile cold file into a formidable prosecution. And it did more than strengthen the charges against Holt. It also reframed the narrative. Evelyn's murder was not a random act of violence. It was a calculated, premeditated killing carried out by a man who believed he could control her, and failing that, decided no one else would. The breakthrough also reignited public interest. National news outlets picked up the story, calling it one of the oldest solved murders in Georgia history. True crime podcasts dissected every development, and former residents of Fairwood returned to share their memories. For the first time in nearly 5 decades, Evelyn Carter's name was back on people's lips, not as a forgotten victim, but as the centerpiece of a relentless pursuit of justice. And yet, amid the excitement, investigators knew their work wasn't done. The final challenge lay ahead, confronting Holt with the weight of the evidence, breaking through his wall of denial, and securing the confession that would leave no doubt in anyone's mind about what happened in the woods that night in 1968. The interrogation room awaited, and with it, the chance to finally hear the truth from the only living person who knew it. From the moment Raymond Holt sat down in the interrogation room, he played the part of an innocent man, calm, polite, cooperative. He even smiled at detectives, asking if they wanted coffee before they began. To anyone watching, he looked more like a man wrongfully accused than someone suspected of one of Georgia's most notorious unsolved murders. But investigators had seen this performance before, and they weren't buying it. Detective Laura McKinney, now head of the cold case unit, started gently. She asked Holt about his time in Fairwood, about the textile mill, about the summer of 1968. He spoke openly, even nostalgically. But when she asked if he remembered Evelyn Carter, something in his demeanor shifted. His smile faltered. His voice tightened. "I don't think I know anyone by that name," he said. It was the first of many lies. Investigators then placed photos of Evelyn in front of him. Yearbook pictures, church choir snapshots, even one taken at a town picnic just weeks before her death. Holt leaned back, studying them with feigned detachment. "Sorry," he muttered. "Doesn't ring a bell." But McKinney didn't stop there. She presented the DNA report, the witness testimony, the workplace records showing disciplinary action. With each new piece of evidence, Holt's explanations grew more erratic. He claimed he'd never been near Evelyn, then later said he might have brushed past her at the bank. He denied knowing where the woods were, only to later describe the area in precise detail. His web of lies was beginning to unravel. As pressure mounted, detectives shifted their strategy. They brought in Holt's ex-wife, who recounted incidents of violence and disturbing comments he'd made over the years. One story in particular struck a chord. Holt had once told her that people who reject love deserve what's coming. The words seemed to echo Evelyn's fate. Then came the final blow. Investigators confronted Holt with the discarded coffee cup they had collected, the one that matched the DNA on Evelyn's dress. "That's science," McKinney said, sliding the report across the table. "Science doesn't lie. You were there." For the first time, Holt's confidence cracked. He ran his hands through his thinning hair, his eyes darting between the detectives and the evidence. After nearly 9 hours of questioning, he whispered a chilling half-confession. "I didn't mean for it to happen. But she made me feel invisible." Though he never described the murder in full detail, his admission, coupled with the overwhelming physical evidence, was enough. Investigators believed Evelyn had rejected Holt's advances, triggering a rage that culminated in her brutal death. And while Holt still refused to take full responsibility, the facade of the polite retiree had shattered. What remained was a portrait of a man who had spent nearly 5 decades hiding behind lies, and who had finally been caught in the truth. The morning of March 14, 2018, dawned crisp and still over Fairwood, the kind of spring day when nothing felt out of the ordinary. Yet in the courthouse 3 blocks from Main Street, a storm decades in the making was about to break. Raymond Holt, now 73, shuffled into the courtroom in handcuffs and a county-issued jumpsuit. His once steady hands trembled slightly as he faced the people of a town he had once walked among unnoticed. For nearly 50 years, he had been just another face in the crowd. Now, he was the face of evil. The arrest had been the talk of Fairwood for months. Reporters crowded the steps of the courthouse, cameras flashing, satellite trucks parked bumper to bumper along the narrow street. National news outlets carried the story live. Cold case killer brought to justice after 50 years. For the Carter family, and for a community haunted by Evelyn's death, this was the moment they had waited a lifetime to see. Yet even as Holt was led into the interrogation room for a final round of questioning, he maintained an unnerving calm. He stuck to his carefully rehearsed denials, insisting he had been framed, that the evidence was circumstantial, and that he was the victim of a witch hunt. Investigators knew better. They had the science, the witnesses, the motive, but they wanted the one thing that still eluded them: a full confession. Detectives decided on a calculated strategy. They began by walking Holt through the timeline of Evelyn's last day, every place she had been, every person she had spoken to, every detail of her final hours. Then they showed him crime scene photos, the dress she had worn, the scrape marks on her hands, the missing wedding band. At first he refused to look. Then, slowly, his eyes lingered. "You were there," Detective McKinney said softly. "You know you were." Silence stretched for several seconds. Then Holt spoke, not with remorse but with irritation. "She thought she was better than me," he muttered. "All of them did." It was the first crack in a wall of denial that had stood for nearly half a century. Over the next 3 hours, Holt's composure crumbled. Piece by piece, investigators dismantled his lies until there was nothing left but the truth. And finally, in a chilling, detached voice, Raymond Holt described what had happened that night, in June 1968. He told them he had followed Evelyn home from work, parking several blocks away so she wouldn't notice. He had approached her near the woods, intending, he claimed, to talk. But when she rejected him, laughing nervously, telling him to leave her alone, something inside him snapped. He grabbed her. She screamed. He choked her until the noise stopped. When she collapsed, he panicked, dragging her deeper into the woods and leaving her there. "I just wanted her to see me," he whispered, "to notice me." The room fell silent. Even the most seasoned detectives felt a cold knot in their stomachs. After all the years, after all the mystery and speculation, Evelyn's final moments had been heartbreakingly simple and brutally senseless. Word of Holt's confession spread quickly. By evening, every major news network was broadcasting the story. Crowds gathered outside the police department, some cheering the long-awaited breakthrough, others too stunned to speak. For the Carter family, the news was bittersweet. "We waited 50 years for this moment," Thomas Carter said tearfully. "And now that it's here, it hurts more than ever." Prosecutors wasted no time. Within weeks, Holt was formally charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and attempted sexual assault. The indictment detailed the brutality of the crime and the decades-long deception that followed. Even in his old age, Holt showed no remorse. During his arraignment, when asked if he understood the charges against him, he stared blankly ahead and muttered, "It doesn't matter now." The community's reaction was complex, a mixture of relief, anger, and disbelief. People who had once shared barbecues and church pews with Holt struggled to reconcile the kindly retiree they thought they knew with the monster he had just revealed himself to be. "He fixed my mailbox once," one neighbor said. "I let him hold my grandkids. I can't even look at his house now." But perhaps the most profound reaction came from Evelyn's old friends, many of them now grandparents themselves. They gathered outside the courthouse holding candles and photos of Evelyn as a young woman. "She was light," one woman whispered, "and he tried to erase her. But look, we're still saying her name." Holt's confession marked the beginning of the end of one of Georgia's longest-running cold cases. It validated decades of relentless work by investigators and offered Evelyn's family something they had once thought impossible: answers. But it also raised haunting new questions. Had Holt killed others? Were there more victims buried in unmarked graves, their stories lost to time? Those questions would linger long after Holt's confession. But for the people of Fairwood, one truth now stood above all others. Evil had lived among them, hidden in plain sight, and justice, though delayed, had finally come knocking. And as Holt was led from the interrogation room to a jail cell where he would spend the rest of his days, Detective McKinney paused at the doorway. 50 years, she said quietly, and she finally gets to rest. By the time Raymond Holt finally faced a jury, he was 78 years old. A frail, white-haired man shuffling into the courtroom in shackles, a stark contrast to the 24-year-old factory worker who had strangled Evelyn Carter 5 decades earlier. Nearly half a century had passed since that summer night in 1968, and the passage of time was evident everywhere. Detectives who once chased leads were long gone, witnesses had passed away or moved across the country, and even the town of Fairwood itself had changed. New buildings stood where old shops once were, children played where woods once whispered. But one thing had not changed: the community's hunger for justice. The trial opened in October 2018 and immediately captured national attention. News vans lined the courthouse square, and seats inside were filled with a mixture of aging locals who remembered Evelyn's smile and younger residents who had grown up hearing her name spoken in hushed tones. For many, this was more than a trial. It was the closing of a wound that had scarred Fairwood for generations. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented the DNA evidence that placed Holt at the scene, the workplace records showing his obsession with Evelyn, and the chilling partial confession he had given during interrogation. Jurors listened intently as experts explained how modern technology had finally unraveled the mystery that 1960s science could not. They also heard from surviving witnesses, including Evelyn's brother, now 70, who described the pain of living decades without answers. "We buried our parents without ever knowing the truth," Thomas Carter testified, his voice trembling. "Today, we stand here for them too." The defense had little to counter with. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the memories of witnesses were unreliable after so many years, and that Holt's age and deteriorating health made him a harmless old man. But the jury wasn't swayed. Age, the prosecution reminded them, did not erase guilt. "He's not harmless," the district attorney said in his closing argument. "He's a predator who has spent 50 years hiding behind the kindness of strangers and the decay of memory, and now the truth has caught up to him." After just 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts, first-degree murder, kidnapping, and attempted sexual assault. The courtroom erupted in sobs, gasps, and quiet prayers. Evelyn's family clutched one another as the judge delivered Holt's sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a punishment Holt would likely serve for only a few years, but it was a symbolic victory, a message that time does not diminish accountability. As he was led from the courtroom, Holt glanced briefly at the Carter family, his expression unreadable. They did not look back. For them, justice had finally come, not swiftly, not easily, but fully. And for the town of Fairwood, the verdict marked the end of one of Georgia's darkest chapters, proving that even when decades pass, truth has a way of finding its way to light. In the months following Raymond Holt's conviction, the town of Fairwood began a slow, painful process of healing, one that had been on hold for more than 5 decades. The courthouse lawn, once crowded with news cameras and satellite trucks, returned to its usual stillness. But the echoes of Evelyn Carter's story continued to ripple far beyond Georgia. True crime podcasts dissected every piece of evidence. Documentaries chronicled the evolution of the case. And for the first time since 1968, Evelyn's name was no longer followed by the word unsolved. For Evelyn's family, the verdict brought a measure of peace but not closure, because closure, they said, was impossible. "You don't move on from something like this," her brother Thomas told a reporter. "You just learn how to carry it." He and his children visited Evelyn's grave for the first time without unanswered questions hanging over their heads. They placed fresh lilies on the headstone, her favorite flower, and whispered words they had waited half a century to say: "We know now. We finally know." The community, too, was transformed. Generations of Fairwood residents had grown up under the shadow of the Carter murder. Parents told their children to avoid the woods on Willow Street. Teachers used Evelyn's story as a cautionary tale about safety and trust. Now, with the truth finally unearthed, the town could begin to reclaim a part of itself. Murals were painted. A scholarship in Evelyn's name was established for young women entering law enforcement, and the wooded path where she was found was renamed Evelyn's Way, a place of reflection rather than fear. Law enforcement agencies across Georgia also studied the case closely. The Carter investigation became a textbook example of how advancements in forensic science, from DNA profiling to digital evidence analysis, could breathe new life into cold cases once considered impossible to solve. Detective Harold Latham, who had passed away decades earlier, was posthumously honored for his relentless pursuit of the truth, even when leads had gone cold and hope had faded. But beneath the pride and relief, there was also a sobering lesson. The revelation that Evelyn's killer had lived among them, shopping in their stores, attending their events, waving politely on the street, unsettled even the most composed members of the community. It was a reminder that evil rarely appears as a monster in the night. More often, it hides in plain sight, wearing a familiar face and a neighbor's smile. For younger generations who hadn't been alive when Evelyn was killed, the case became a symbol of perseverance, proof that justice can be delayed, but not denied. For the older residents, it was a bittersweet ending to a nightmare that had shaped their lives for more than half a century. And for the Carter family, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where Evelyn was remembered not as a victim frozen in time, but as a daughter, a sister, and a bright young woman whose story would outlive the darkness that ended her life. In the end, the story of Evelyn Carter wasn't just about a murder solved after 50 years. It was about faith in the relentless march of truth. It was about the power of a small town refusing to forget. And above all, it was about a promise, whispered in a courtroom, spoken at a graveside, echoed in every corner of Fairwood, that no matter how long it takes, justice will find its way home. If stories like Evelyn's remind you why the pursuit of truth matters, don't leave just yet. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we have more haunting cold cases, shocking confessions, and unbelievable true crime stories waiting for you. And in the comments, tell us, do you believe justice can still be served after so much time has passed?